Good morning, everybody. It's August 5th, 2026, and America is on fire. Not in the dramatic headline sense where I'm exaggerating for views, literally. As of this week, the National Interagency Fire Center has confirmed 99 large uncontained wildfires burning across this country at the same time, and the nation just got bumped up to preparedness level 5. That's the highest level that exists. There is no level 6. When you hit PL5, that's the government's way of saying every single resource we have is already committed, and we are officially out of backup. So far this year, more than 45,800 individual wildfires have burned over 2 million acres across the United States. To put that in perspective, that blows past the 10-year average for this point in the season, which usually sits somewhere around 7 million acres. We are not just having a bad fire season. We are having one of the most aggressive starts to a fire year that this country has logged in over a decade, and peak fire season, the part where things usually get worse, not better, technically hasn't even fully arrived yet. Washington State just declared a statewide emergency. Spokane looks like something out of a disaster movie, except nobody yelled cut. Oregon just broke its own modern wildfire record with almost 2 months of typical fire season still left on the calendar. And out in western Colorado, this fire season already has a body count, real firefighters, real names, real families that are never getting them back. So today we're going deep on all of it. Where these fires are burning, why the country's firefighting system is stretched thinner than it has been in years, what role budget cuts and staffing shortages are actually playing in this, and the human cost that most national coverage is treating like a footnote. Stick around, because toward the end, we're going to connect a pattern that almost nobody is talking about, the one linking this exact fire season to decisions that were made in Washington, D.C., months before a single spark ever hit the ground. Think about the sheer geography involved here for a second. 99 large fires means this crisis is stretched across the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, the Desert Southwest, and pockets of the South and Midwest all at once. That's not a regional emergency anymore. That's a coast-to-coast strain test on an entire national system that was never designed to have every single one of its resources pulled in a dozen directions simultaneously. And the officials running that system aren't hiding how serious this is. They're using words like record-setting, historic, and unprecedented, not because it makes for a better press release, but because the actual data backs it up. Let's start with the fire that's actually made it onto the national news, because it's the one with the body count of homes attached to it. The Spokane complex. This isn't one fire, it's a cluster of them, Old Trails, Fairview, and Autumn Lane, that all lit up and basically fed off each other until they became one giant regional nightmare. Roughly 7,700 acres burned, 0% contained as of the latest reports, and here's the number that should stop you cold. About 640 structures destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Somewhere around 60,000 residents in the Spokane area had to evacuate, and thousands more lost power completely. Washington's governor, Bob Ferguson, came out and put it about as bluntly as a politician possibly can, saying the emergency declaration was because of drought conditions, unusually high temperatures, and high winds all stacking on top of each other to create record-setting wildfires. When your own governor is using the phrase record-setting in a state that has been fighting fires for well over a century, that's not spin. That's just the truth landing with a thud. And when you line that number up against the state's own history, it gets even heavier. Washington's costliest wildfire event on record before this year was back in 2023, when a group of fires burned down 710 structures. The Spokane complex alone is already sitting at around 640, and it's 0% contained. So basically, Mother Nature looked at Washington's worst wildfire record and said, "Hold my drought." And this is one fire complex out of 17 others currently burning across the state at the same time. Local officials briefed reporters over the weekend, calling this whole cluster the Spokane Complex Fires. And in the same breath, they confirmed Washington now has 17 active large fires statewide, meaning Spokane isn't even close to the only community holding its breath right now. The Commissioner of Public Lands didn't sugarcoat what's coming either, warning that with more heat and wind expected through the rest of summer, any new spark on tinder dry landscapes could turn into the next devastating wildfire, and directly urging residents not to be that spark. When a state official is personally pleading with an entire population not to accidentally start the next disaster, you know the margin for error has basically disappeared. Now travel about 100 and some miles northeast and you hit the Kaiser Canyon fire, which is currently the largest active fire burning in the entire state of Washington. This one started from a lightning strike back on July the 16th on the Colville Reservation, and it has since ripped through more than 134,000 acres. Containment sits around 38%, which sounds decent until you remember that means well over half of a fire the size of a mid-sized city is still completely wide open and doing whatever it wants. Cross the border into Oregon, and the numbers get almost absurd. The Coleman Creek fire out in Harney County has burned over 212,000 acres and sits at 0% containment. Zero. That's not a typo. That's a fire that fire crews have essentially not been able to lay a single finger on yet, and it's dumping heavy smoke across the entire eastern Oregon high desert. Not far away, the Crosswhite Fire in Wheeler County has burned almost 190,000 acres, but crews have actually made real progress there, pushing containment up to about 48%, after what officials are calling an aggressive suppression push. So that's the split screen right now. One fire nobody can touch. Another fire crews are finally starting to wrestle to the ground, and they're burning less than a county apart from each other. Oregon overall currently has 32 active large fires, which is the most of any state in the country right now. And get this, with almost 2 full months of the traditional fire season still remaining, Oregon has already set a modern record for total acres burned in a single year. Let that sink in for a second. The record isn't from the end of the season looking back. The record already happened, and the season isn't even close to over. Idaho and Montana are each dealing with 7 active large fires of their own, including Idaho's Tartar Fire, which has already climbed past 97,000 acres. Minnesota and California are each running 6 active large fires. Colorado and Nevada have 5 apiece. Florida and Utah have 3 each. And then you've got a scattered list of states: Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Wyoming, each nursing at least 1 active large fire of their own. This isn't a West Coast story anymore. This is a continental story with the flames just concentrated hardest in the Pacific Northwest and the interior West. Down in Colorado, the Gold Mountain Fire in Ouray County has burned close to 9,500 acres, but it's actually 72% contained, which right now makes it basically the good news story of this entire briefing. And that's not nothing, because this exact fire is also connected to one of the darkest parts of this fire season, which we're going to get to in a minute, because that's not a story you can just fold into a list of acreage numbers and move on from. California, meanwhile, is currently running 6 active large fires of its own, and Nevada is sitting at 5. That might sound almost quiet compared to Oregon's 32 or Washington's 17, but don't mistake fewer fires for a calm situation. California's fire agencies have spent the entire summer bracing for exactly this kind of season, watching their own reservoirs and fuel moisture readings the way a poker player watches the table, because everybody in that state knows their worst months traditionally land later in the year, not earlier. Utah has 3 active large fires of its own, tangled up in the same brutal stretch of terrain along the Colorado border that's already claimed lives this season. And earlier this summer, one fire out there was actually the largest burning anywhere in the entire country at that point, blackening forest land fast enough that residents were put on notice within days of ignition. And it's not just the fires themselves. The National Weather Service issued what it called a particularly dangerous situation red flag warning for parts of the Utah-Colorado border region, and officials confirmed that was the very first time in that office's history they had ever used that specific designation. Meteorologists don't reach for a brand new warning label lightly. When the people whose entire job is measuring wind, humidity, and fuel dryness say they've never needed to say this before, that's not dramatic Weather Channel language. That's a genuine first-of-its-kind alert for conditions nobody currently working there had ever officially classified before. Let's talk about what Preparedness Level 5 actually means, because I don't think people fully grasp the weight behind that number. The National Interagency Fire Center runs a 5-tier system to track how strained the country's wildland firefighting resources are at any given moment. Level 1 means resources are basically sitting around waiting for something to do. Level 5 means every major geographic area in the country is dealing with large, complex incidents at the same time. And the shared national pool of firefighters, engines, air tankers, and incident management teams is maxed out. There's no reserve bench to call up. Everybody who can be deployed already is deployed. Right now there are more than 28,700 personnel assigned to incidents nationwide. And if a brand new fire breaks out somewhere that isn't already burning, the honest answer is the cavalry might not be able to show up as fast as anyone would like, because the cavalry is already 3 states over fighting somebody else's fire. And here's the part that should make you a little uneasy. This isn't the first time this decade the country has hit PL5. It happened in 2020, during that historic western fire season that burned over 10 million acres and killed 47 people directly, with more than 1,300 structures destroyed and damage estimates north of $19 billion. The fact that we are back at the ceiling again just a few years later, and doing it earlier in the season than usual, tells you this isn't a one-off bad summer. It's starting to look like the new normal is simply worse than the old normal. And if you actually line up the last 3 years side by side, the trend gets even harder to wave off as noise. In 2024, roughly 64,900 fires burned nearly 9 million acres nationwide, destroying over 4,500 structures and killing 11 people. In 2025, that number of individual fires jumped to over 72,000, and even though total acreage came down to about 5 million, the death toll climbed to 31. Now in 2026, we're already sitting at 45,800 plus fires, and 2 million acres burned, and we haven't even hit the traditional peak of the season yet. Different years, different regions catching the worst of it, but the same basic shape every single time. More fires starting earlier, more acreage burning faster, and firefighting agencies squeezed harder each year to keep up with a threat that keeps arriving before anyone's fully ready for it. So why is the system this stretched? Part of it is pure weather. Below average winter snowfall across huge chunks of the West meant less moisture locked into the ground heading into summer. Persistent drought conditions dried out vegetation months before fire season traditionally ramps up. Add in unrelenting heat and repeated bouts of dry lightning, especially across the Pacific Northwest, and you've basically preloaded the landscape like a stack of kindling waiting for a match. Except this year the matches have been striking themselves constantly. But weather alone doesn't fully explain why the response system itself feels this thin, and that's where things get a lot more uncomfortable. Because part of this story is about money and staffing, not just heat and wind. Earlier this year, the USO, Forest Service absorbed a budget cut of roughly $438 million, and that came alongside thousands of staff departures across the agency. Lawmakers, including Senator Patty Murray, have publicly raised alarms about the potential closure of key wildfire research stations in Washington state, the exact state that's currently watching its own history books get rewritten in real time. On top of that, earlier this year, the federal government consolidated its wildland firefighting forces into a brand new single agency, the U.S. Wildland Fire Service, folding together resources that used to be spread across multiple departments, including funding that had previously flowed through other channels tied to environmental protection budgets. The idea, at least on paper, was to streamline the response and cut through bureaucratic overlap. But this fire season is the first real live fire test of that new structure, and it's being tested under the worst possible conditions at preparedness level 5, with fewer staff, a smaller budget, and more fire on the ground than the 10-year average. It's a little bit like deciding to renovate your house's plumbing system during a flood. Maybe the new pipes are better in theory. You're just finding that out while the basement's already underwater. It's also worth understanding what actually happens once a region blows past its own resources, because it's not like there's an infinite backup supply sitting in a warehouse somewhere. When a state's crews and aircraft are maxed out, the request goes up the chain to the regional coordination centers, and eventually to the national level, where incident management teams essentially triage the entire country and decide which fire gets the next available hotshot crew, which fire gets the next air tanker, and which fire simply has to wait its turn while it keeps growing. At preparedness level 5, that triage list is long and everybody on it is already burning. Washington's own Commissioner of Public Lands put it about as plainly as anyone in government has all summer, saying flatly that this year has already been one of the busiest wildfire years on record, and August had barely even started when he said it. The dollars behind all of this add up fast, too. Washington's state legislature more than doubled its own firefighting budget for 2026, pushing it up to $120 million, twice what it appropriated the year before, specifically because officials could already see this kind of season coming based on drought and snowpack data. That's a state deciding to spend twice as much money just to try to keep pace with a threat that federal cuts were simultaneously making harder to fight. States are effectively trying to fill in gaps that opened up somewhere else in the system, and that's before you even get to the private cost, insurance payouts, rebuilding expenses, and the simple fact that when 640 structures disappear in a weekend, that's not an abstract number, that's hundreds of families suddenly needing somewhere to live tonight. Now here's the part of this story that I don't want to rush past, because numbers on acreage and containment percentages are one thing, but this fire season has already cost real lives, and those lives deserve more than a passing mention buried under statistics. On June 27th, in a remote stretch of Mesa County near the Colorado-Utah border, a heli-tac crew was responding to a wildfire that started as two smaller blazes, the Knowles Fire and the Gore Fire, which then merged with other fires and became known as the Snyder Fire. These crews are the ones who get dropped by helicopter directly into hard-to-reach terrain, with the job of catching new fire starts before they explode into something unmanageable. It is some of the most dangerous work in the entire firefighting profession. That day, 5 federal firefighters were caught in what's called a burnover, which happens when a fire spreads fast enough to cut off every single escape route, forcing crews to deploy their emergency fire shelters and essentially lie on the ground while the fire burns directly over them. 2 firefighters survived with burn injuries. 3 did not. Their names were released a few days later. Emily Barker, 38 years old, from Clinton Township, Michigan, assigned to the Forest Service's Rifle Heli-tac crew. Nick Hutcherson, 27, from Glendale, Arizona, with the Forest Service's Kaibab National Forest crew. And Sydney Watson, 27, from Warrior, Alabama, assigned to the U.S. Wildland Fire Service's Rifle Helitack Unit. A fourth firefighter, Nathan Matthews, was critically injured that same day and passed away nearly a month later on July 24th. These were the very first line of duty deaths for the newly formed U.S. Wildland Fire Service, and officials have said the agency stands united with the Forest Service in grief for the families left behind. And the tragedy in that region didn't stop there. Weeks later, while battling the Gold Mountain fire near Ouray, the same fire that's now sitting at 72% containment, a firefighting helicopter went down at Silverjack Reservoir. The pilot, Nicholas Dale, from British Columbia, Canada, was killed in the crash. His helicopter has since been recovered and transported for a full investigation, with a preliminary report expected from the National Transportation Safety Board roughly 30 days after the crash. Colorado Senator John Hickenlooper has publicly called for a full investigation into the decisions that preceded the deaths near Mesa County, saying plainly that these families deserve answers about what went wrong so it doesn't happen again. That's not a political talking point, that's a basic human request. When 5 people go into a fire and only 2 come out unhurt, the country owes their families a straight explanation, not a press release with the details smoothed over. I want to sit with that for a second before we move forward, because it's easy in a briefing like this to slide from acreage numbers straight into the next headline. But behind every containment percentage on a map, there are crews on the ground in extreme heat, on cliffs and canyon terrain so steep that heavy equipment can barely be moved into position, doing a job most of us would never volunteer for. Utah's governor, watching the same fire complex from across the border, described what he was seeing on the ground as grimmer than anything he'd witnessed before, and asked people to pray for the crews and for the rain the region desperately needs. That's the kind of statement that tells you everything about how serious this actually is, without needing a single statistic attached to it. Idaho's Tartar Fire deserves a beat of its own attention too, because at 97,000 plus acres and climbing, it's edging towards 6-figure territory in a state that's already stretched managing 7 active large fires simultaneously. Montana is carrying the same load, 7 of its own active large fires, in a state where ranching communities and small mountain towns don't exactly have Spokane-sized emergency infrastructure to fall back on when evacuation orders come down. These aren't the fires making national front pages, but for the people living inside those evacuation zones, the scale of national coverage means nothing. What matters is whether the wind shifts tonight and whether there's still a crew available to respond if it does. All right, let's zoom out to the bigger national and even international picture here, because this fire crisis is not staying inside state lines, and it's not staying inside America's borders either. Up in Canada, the 2026 wildfire season has already logged nearly 1,500 individual fires and burned roughly 195,000 acres as of the most recent tally, with major activity across Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, and at least 1 firefighter death recorded in Nova Scotia. Smoke doesn't respect a border on a map. When Canada's boreal forests are burning at the same time the American West is at preparedness level 5, that smoke drifts, air quality alerts start stacking up across multiple countries, and you end up with hazy skies as far away as the Midwest and even the East Coast, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the nearest actual flame. Meanwhile, down in the Southwest, extreme heat has been gripping the region on top of everything else, with flood watches and blowing dust advisories layering in as monsoon activity increases across places like the Tucson metro area. So you've got a country simultaneously dealing with historic wildfire acreage in the north and west, extreme heat and dust events in the southwest, and enough smoke drifting eastward to affect air quality for people who might not even know a fire is burning anywhere near them. This is what a genuinely nationwide climate and resource strain event actually looks like. Not one dramatic fire making headlines for a week and then fading away, but dozens of fires across a dozen states, all competing for the same limited pool of personnel, aircraft, and money, all at the exact same time. There's also a global angle to this that rarely makes it into domestic coverage, which is that the United States isn't the only country burning through its own resources right now. Australia has been busy setting new standard procedures for its own air tanker fleet after reviewing a previous crash, and multiple European countries have been running synchronized cross-border wildfire response tests, essentially rehearsing the exact kind of mutual aid scenario that North America is currently living through in real time. Fire agencies worldwide are increasingly treating this as a shared, recurring problem rather than a series of isolated regional disasters, because the underlying drivers, hotter summers, drier winters, and more explosive fire behavior, aren't unique to any one country's forests. Now here's the connection that I don't think enough people are actually making. So let's fly up to about 40,000 feet and look at the whole picture at once. This fire season did not start in June when the first big blazes broke out. It started months earlier, back in January, when the National Interagency Fire Center issued its seasonal fire outlook and projected above normal wildfire risk for huge parts of the country, including Texas, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and the broader southeastern United States, on top of the already fire-prone West. That forecast was public. Officials knew this was coming, and it landed in the same year that the Forest Service absorbed a budget cut north of $400 million and lost thousands of staff. And in the same year, the federal government was mid-restructure, standing up an entirely new wildland fire agency from scratch. So you had a season predicted to be above normal for risk, layered on top of an agency going through its biggest structural overhaul in years, layered on top of a workforce that had already been thinned out before a single major fire even ignited. That's not a coincidence lining up badly. That's a predictable collision that a lot of people in and around the wildfire response world saw coming from a mile away. The drought didn't create the staffing shortage. The heat didn't write the budget. Those are two completely separate decisions that both happened to land in the exact same calendar year as one of the most extreme fire seasons on record. And now we're watching what happens when a stretched, restructured system meets a season that was never going to be easy in the first place. And look at the pattern and how this keeps repeating itself year after year. Warmer temperatures are pushing snowmelt earlier and earlier every spring, which means the ground is drying out sooner. Fall and winter precipitation keeps arriving later, which shortens the window when the landscape actually gets a chance to recover moisture before the next fire season starts stacking up again. Bark beetles and invasive species like cheatgrass are killing off healthy trees and replacing native vegetation with exactly the kind of dry, flammable fuel that turns a small spark into a 200,000-acre fire in a matter of weeks. None of these are new discoveries. Scientists and fire officials have been describing this exact feedback loop for years. What's different this year is that it's colliding head-on with a firefighting system that has less funding and fewer boots on the ground than it's had in a long time. Right at the moment, it needed more of both. So when you ask why a fire like Coleman Creek in Oregon is still sitting at 0% containment after burning over 200 to 12,000 acres, the honest answer isn't just wind and heat. It's also that there are 99 other large fires competing for the exact same limited pool of air tankers, hotshot crews, and incident commanders, and preparedness level 5 means there simply isn't a deep bench left to pull from. Every fire is essentially fighting every other fire for the same finite resources, at the same time, in the same summer, and the country's newest firefighting agency is trying to run that entire operation while it's still, functionally, in its first fire season of existence. The blockade here isn't a foreign power closing a shipping lane. It's a landscape primed by drought closing off entire regions, and a resource pool that can't stretch any further than it already has. And unlike a diplomatic standoff, there's no phone call that ends this one overnight. There's no deal, no ceasefire, no locked and loaded statement that changes the outcome. The only thing that actually changes this pattern is rain, cooler temperatures, and, over the longer run, a serious national conversation about whether the agencies fighting these fires are funded and staffed for the reality we're actually living in now, instead of the reality we used to live in 20 years ago. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with, and it's the timing question nobody in the mainstream coverage seems to want to ask out loud. The Wildland Fire Service was stood up specifically to be more efficient, to cut the layers of red tape between a fire starting and a crew actually being on scene. That's a reasonable goal on paper, and there are genuine arguments for streamlining an old, fragmented system. But standing up an entirely new agency, redrawing reporting lines, moving budgets between departments, and asking staff to learn new procedures, all of that takes bandwidth, even in a quiet year. Doing it in the same 12 months that the National Interagency Fire Center had already forecast above normal risk for huge parts of the country isn't malicious, but it also isn't nothing. It's the equivalent of switching your entire team's playbook the week before the biggest game of the season and hoping everybody adjusts fast enough not to fumble. Sometimes that works out fine. This year, with 99 large fires burning at once and the country pinned at preparedness level 5, it's fair to ask whether the timing made an already difficult season measurably harder than it needed to be. And look at what's actually being asked for in response. Lawmakers like Senator Pedersen have already introduced a package of wildfire-focused bills following the deaths near Mesa County, aimed at tightening up safety protocols and getting straight answers about what led to that burnover in the first place. Hickenlooper is pushing for the same kind of accountability. None of that fixes this season. The fires burning right now are going to keep burning, regardless of what happens in a committee hearing 3 months from now. But it does tell you where this story goes next once the smoke clears and the acreage numbers stop climbing. This turns into a funding fight, a staffing fight, and a fight over whether the agencies protecting these towns get the resources that match the actual size of the threat, instead of the size of the threat as it existed a decade or two ago. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this is purely a weather and climate story? Something that was always going to happen, regardless of budget decisions? Or do you think the staffing cuts and the restructuring genuinely made this season worse than it needed to be? Drop your take in the comments, because I'd genuinely like to see where people land on this one. And if this kind of on-the-ground, no-fluff breakdown of what's actually happening in this country is useful to you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next update as these fires develop, and share this with anyone you know living in the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, or honestly anywhere downwind, because a lot of people still have no idea just how close to the edge this system currently is. We'll keep tracking Coleman Creek, Kaiser Canyon, and the Spokane complex as containment numbers change. And if this preparedness level 5 status holds much longer, we'll be right back here breaking down what happens next. And if you want to actually understand where this country's climate and resource pressures are heading next, rather than just reacting to whichever fire happens to trend for a day, this is exactly the kind of story worth following closely over the next few weeks, because peak season is still ahead of us, not behind us. Thanks for reading, and stay safe out there.